our crops, productivity of our crops, and the trend in our population, which is an upward trend, will have another effect on our overall food security. Underlying all of this is the issue of climate change, and I want to talk briefly about climate change. I do apologize if sometimes I go into rather a lot of detail, and sometimes detail is difficult for some people. I'm appreciative of the fact that it's a very mixed audience, so we will do our best to get a balance right. So having looked at climate change, I want to look at where we get our energy from, the different energy sources, and what the targets are for the future. Clearly, in this area, solar will have its part to play, but we need to examine all our different energy sources and look at their efficiency. So I ask the question, is solar efficient? And then whatever the assumptions are, we know it will be there. So we need to make sure it's in the right place. So what are the sites where we can put solar power? One of the big issues with anything we do is biodiversity, and solar power, solar panels, photovoltaics as we call them, will have an effect on biodiversity. I want to take you through all the points that relate to that. And finally, I want to go through some of the other issues connected with solar farms, not least the dangers of fire and explosion, which are getting a lot of publicity at this current time. So that's what you're going to be listening to over the next few minutes. And obviously that will give you a guide if you start to get bored as to how long there is still to go. So let's move on if we can, Andy. And now what's he doing here? This might a bit surprise you because of course a very recognizable figure of Alan Titchmarsh. One of the things I realized when I got involved with land use issues, with solar farm issues, if you've got a particular point of view and you want to get that point of view across, it's a great help if you have a personality that's prepared to agree with you and put his voice behind what you have to say. Well, I've known Alan for many years. He was the patron of the college at Writtle when I was principal there. And then I realized that Alan had a view on solar farms when I heard him speaking about one very near him in Hampshire. So I said, Alan, could you give a quote for us about one that I'm not very happy with near our own area in Chelmsford, the Longfield proposal? And Alan provided the quote, which will appear on screen in the next slide. I'll read it out to you. The government must urgently re-evaluate its criteria for solar-based, nationally significant infrastructure projects. Large-scale solar farms are increasingly being proposed on inappropriate sites for their scale, and people are right to be concerned. There is an abundance of alternative brownfield sites and plenty of potential for solar in industrial areas, as opposed to the delicately balanced ecosystems and high-grade farmland that we are seeing proposed instead. The proposed Longfield solar farm in Essex is yet another scheme that is simply too large for the area. And if it goes ahead, it will be the largest single site solar power plant in the UK. With careful planning, we can achieve our renewable energy goals without making poor short-term choices. I want to spend the next few minutes justifying what Alan wrote for us. And so, as I said in the introduction, let's move on to look at land use in the United Kingdom. Well, we have 6 million hectares of arable land, and that arable land area is declining. It's the lowest amount of arable land that we've had in use since World War II. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the various translations that we can use, but in essence, 6 million hectares is around 14 million acres, and an acre is just a little bit larger than a football pitch. So it gives you some idea of the scope of what we're talking about. Just to home in on England, in the 10-year period 2009 to 2019, there was something like 300,000 hectares lost, or around 700,000 acres. And the best estimate we have at the moment is that is in the United Kingdom as a whole, we're losing something like 40,000 hectares a year. The probability is that this is more, and it's certainly increasing, which is why the 2+ signs are put against that figure. This isn't, of course, just for solar farms. It is for all sorts of initiatives like the housing that we're putting in, like the infrastructure projects like HS2, like woodland area and so on. Indeed, if you look at the 4th bullet point, I note the government's target of 30,000 hectares a year for tree planting. and the eventual aim of getting to something like 30% of our land under trees. Now that's a trade-off, that's a good trade-off, because of course trees are a carbon sink, and we're trying to move to a carbon neutral economy. Trees are going to play a great part in doing this. We have some of the lowest area of woodland in the whole of Europe. Our average is around 12%. Europe is 30% plus. And again, put on a world scale, similar figures would apply. So that's a good target. And it's fair to say that 30,000 hectares tend to be on poorer grade land. And so that won't have a massive impact on food production. But nevertheless, it's a change in land use. And the last point is one I want to talk about a bit later on in my talk, which is a new government scheme, which is called Environmental Land Management, ELM. It's replacing the old countryside stewardship schemes that were part of the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. And it does mean that land will not be in productive use, but will be much more in environmental use. But of course, good as that scheme is, it will mean that there will be less food production and less land directly used for food production. A term that's come in very recently is also connected with that, the term rewilding. Rewilding simply means letting land do its own thing and revert to nature. And again, that will be land that won't be productive, but maybe fulfilling a very important environmental function. And then, of course, we have the new planning laws, which I'm sure you're aware are quite controversial for a number of people, where land will be put into protective zones or zones that can be developed. Well, the idea is that there'll be more development zones, and that in itself will mean more land lost, often more farmland, often land that could have a lot of other values, but we need houses. And of course, I then say, and solar farms, because I'm going to show you in a minute how they're increasing quite dramatically, and again, have a very major impact on land use. So if we can move to the next slide, please. This shows you exactly what is happening in terms of land use by solar farms. I split the solar farms into two. In Alan Titchmarsh's introductory words, there was the reference to nationally significant infrastructure projects, NSIPs. These are projects which are generating electricity of more than 50 megawatts. And there are 3 such projects currently in the pipeline, and we anticipate there will be many more. Cleve Hill is one that's already had approval for proceeding. This is near Faversham in Kent, and is clearly a scheme that will have a big impact in that area. Sunnica is a scheme near Newmarket and is currently awaiting application to go before the planning inspectorate. It's already gone through the consultative phase. And Longfield is a site near Chelmsford, which is the one I'm immediately concerned with, which is a 1,000-acre site, and again will have a significant impact on our local area. So those are what are called nationally significant infrastructure projects. But there are also many other projects that go through local planning authorities. Recently, I did a study in Essex and came across 12 schemes that were going to occupy around 700 hectares. That's in the order of 1,800 acres. I now discover that there's several more that I hadn't known about when I put this lecture together. I also did a Google search to try and find out the position nationally, and came across over 50 schemes in England and Wales occupying 5,000 hectares. Some of you may have seen the Mail on Sunday a couple of weeks back, and the reporter that I was involved with in helping to put that article together, a lady called Amy Oliver, actually did a search and found 257 schemes. I've since discovered there are more, and so we're probably looking at around 300 schemes nationally that are occupying probably many tens of thousands of hectares. And the reason I've put right at the bottom of that slide local versus national is that we all know about the NSIPs, the national schemes. They're out there in the public domain, but no one really knows about all the local schemes. And if you take, for example, my local authority, Braintree, the Braintree District Council doesn't know what's happening in the Chelmsford City Council. Chelmsford City Council doesn't really know what's happening in Uttersfield District Council. The Essex authorities don't know what's happening in Devon. The Devon authorities don't know what's happening in Northumberland or Lincolnshire, and so it goes on. And what is happening is that a lot of farms are getting approval, a lot of solar farms are getting approval on the back of a desire by local authorities to hit their carbon neutral targets. They believe they're doing a great job. They believe this is a very worthwhile thing to grant approval without realizing what is happening all around them and what a massive number of farms are going forward with a huge impact on potential land use. So that's where we are with land use and solar farms. Let's move on to just discover how we classify our land. Now, this is very important because this provides the basis for planning authorities to give approval. And we have had for many years an agricultural land classification system that puts land into basically 6 grades and also has classifications for non-agricultural use. Grade 1 land is excellent land. This is land that will produce high yields of a full range of crops and do it consistently and do it very, very well. Grade 2 land is also high quality land. It may have very minor limitations, but in general terms will produce very good yields year on year. Likewise, 3A is good quality land, but it may have a few limitations. It maybe can't produce the best yields of some of the more demanding horticultural crops, but generally it's regarded as very good quality land. 3B, and you may have noticed I said 6 grades, but it only runs to 5. Well, the grade 3 was split into 2. And 3B is land of moderate quality where there can be some limitations. But make no doubt, take no doubt about it, 3B land can still produce some extremely good crops and really is very important for our future agriculture. Once you move down the scale, of course, grade 4 land is poorer. It's more for grassland, for fodder crops. It can produce cereal crops, but they are likely to be of poorer quality. Grade 5 is very poor land. It's only for permanent pasture, poor upland grazing, and so on. So those are the 5 grades. Now, in terms of how we use those grades, the grades 1 to 3A are classified as BMV land. This is best and most versatile land. And that is a very important term because BMV land is the land that has a lot of protection in what is called NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. This demands that local authorities, that the Planning Inspectorate, try and protect such land because it's regarded as very important for food production. Some of us feel, and I've been working with Dr. John Constable, who is the director of the Renewable Energy Foundation, to try and get 3B land included in this classification because we know that 3B land can produce good crops. And it's a planning loophole that such land is actually excluded. What happens is that the agricultural land classification scheme is based on maps that are 1 to 250,000 scale, and they're regarded as very good for strategic purposes. But when it comes to going for a detailed change of use, then often the developer will get a land classification done on a more detailed level. What we have found, and it's not particularly surprising, is that a lot of land that strategically has been shown as 2 or 3A, all of a sudden becomes 3B when the change is done. Sometimes this is done properly. There are very detailed metrics published and available, and sometimes these are used properly. But I've looked at a number of schemes nationally, and what I have found is that sometimes the people the developer has employed have not done the change accurately, and land is downgraded without justification, just simply in order to allow planning approval to take place. So there are worries in the land classification scheme being used badly, but nevertheless, that is as it is, and we must make sure we use it wisely, and we do protect BMV and, in my view, 3B land as well. Now, moving on, all this relates to food security. And where we are at the moment is shown in those figures at the top. Currently, 60% of all the food we produce is produced in the UK by UK farmers. 75% of that is our indigenous food, the food that we can grow in this climate. So we import 40% of our food, we import 25% of our indigenous food. Now, on top of the land loss that I've been talking about, our population is growing. For years, I used to teach the fact that it was 56 million people in the UK. Well, of course, since those days, it's risen to its current 68 million. Growth is slow at the moment. It's reckoned to be something like 0.6%. But nevertheless, that's an extra 400,000 mouths a year to feed. And so we have more mouths to feed. We are importing more food. And one of the factors that also is very important is that the yield of our crops has flattened off and has done for some while. So if you look at the next slide, which I admit is a little bit busy, but basically it's showing the yields over a 14, 15-year period for wheat, for barley, for oats, for oilseed. And I could produce a similar map for potatoes, for sugar beet and other crops. Now, since the last year on that slide, there have been 2 or 3 years with a massive downturn. Indeed, 2020, we saw dramatic drops in crop yield. And if you take the moving average over the last 20 years, the yield of nearly all our major crops has totally plateaued. There's a lecture in discussing that by itself, but we can't go into that. But I think you can see that if our crops are yielding the same, if our land in use is less, and if there's more mouths to feed, then we're going to have a greater food security issue problem. So moving on to the next slide, what I am telling you and what I have worked out, it's very easy to work out, is that by the time we get to 2030, and that's not long into the future, half our food will be imported. If you look at climate change, that will also have a dramatic effect on food production. The government's energy white paper that came out in November last year said that if there was a 4-degree rise in temperature, 4-degree centigrade rise, then the amount of poor land, this would be grade 4 or 5 land, would increase from 15 to 70%. And obviously our food production would dramatically fall. Well, obviously we hope we won't get anything like a 4-degree centigrade rise. That would be a very, very high rise. But certainly 1.5 seems more than likely, and that will have a big effect on what food we can produce. Only yesterday, government were warned in a paper that it's not taking food security seriously. They were warned that we are not prepared for the effect of climate change on our food production. So this is a very important point, and one that our politicians must take very seriously. The assumption is that we can import food. Well, let's just have a brief look at what the situation is in the world. And I quote some research from the University of Minnesota, which was done in conjunction with a number of other universities. That research talked about the average production of the major crops that we grow. It talked about barley, cassava, maize, oil palm, rapeseed, rice, sorghum, sugarcane, and wheat. And these 10 crops between them provide something in the order of 83% of all calories produced on cropland. The university stated that these are being affected by climate change, and they have already noted a decline of 1% in world production of these essential crops. I talk about an EEA report. This is the European Environment Agency, and in last year said crops and livestock production is projected to decrease throughout Europe and may even have to be abandoned in Europe's southern and Mediterranean regions. And it talks specifically about a lot of crops and how there'll be a downturn in European food production. In the House of Commons, when I did some research, I came across a paper on food security. This paper actually did point out the serious worries about our future security. And just as an aside, we had to tell a local MP that it existed. They said they couldn't find it, so I had to get it from the House of Commons library and actually send them a copy. I won't name names, but that's an interesting factor of how unseriously some people take this issue. In any event, this paper said food security is recognized as an extremely important point. However, the government believes that it isn't an issue of great concern because food can always be imported. And anyhow, if climate change has an effect, we can grow crops that are more suited to the warmer climates. Well, yes, great. We can have many more vineyards. We can perhaps grow more sorghum and maize, but we are still going to have a paucity of food, and that needs to be remembered. Food security isn't simply a matter of looking at the production of food. It also involves other issues, and food poverty is one. I accept this is more related on the ability of people to buy food, but nevertheless, if food is more difficult to import, there's a cost, and that cost will increase food poverty. FSA is the Food Standards Agency. The report in 2018 indicated 18% of families in this country were in some form of food poverty. There are now clearly many more. Simply look at the food banks, the food that has been collected for these banks in many supermarkets and so on. It is a very major issue. But it's not simply these factors. There are very fragile food supply chains. I think the pandemic illustrated that very well. And of course, Brexit does and did. If you're in Northern Ireland, you're worried about your sausages. A few months ago, we were worried about our toilet rolls. But there are more serious consequences than that. And anyone that's involved in food importation will tell you how difficult some of these things are. There are import costs, which I've talked about, and there can be environmental damage as well, because some of the country's production systems where we're importing food from are far from brilliant in terms of their environmental impacts. We have all been hearing recently, of course, about the new trade deal with Australia and Australian beef affecting beef being produced in this country. Well, that's a fact. But the most disturbing thing, of course, is what is the carbon footprint on bringing beef from the other side of the world to here? Quite considerable, I would suggest. And if you had beans from Kenya or soft fruit from Spain, all these facts have to be borne in mind. It really is quite a damaging thing to the environment. The message, of course, is produce locally, and eat locally. So let's move on. That's food security, and that really is a very important area. These just illustrate, and I accept that's rather a busy slide, these just illustrate population and self-sufficiency projections, which taken beyond 2013 simply show more and more food being imported, and with all the difficulties connected with that. So I must move us on now to look at climate change. Clearly, this is the elephant in the room, and this is what's affecting all our discussions. And so to bring us right up to date, the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, produced a paper in February of this year and showed that the last 6 years, this is in the world as a whole, the last 6 years since 1880, the years 2016, 2019, and 2020 had the highest temperatures. Those temperatures coincide with a similar position in this country, which explains the earlier facts I was telling you about drop in crop yields. In 2020, the temperatures were 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial era, which is usually taken as the 1880 figure. The aim is to keep our temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade. That was the figure quoted in the Paris Accord, with a preferable figure of 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. The fact is that scientists believe that 1.5 degrees centigrade is almost certain in the next 15 years. And the most recent report, produced only a few weeks ago, said that we were likely to hit 1.5 degrees centigrade in 1 year in the next 5. Not as a permanent rise of 1.5, but nevertheless, the move in that direction. Last year, CO2 levels were 2.57 parts per million higher than the previous year, with a high peak of 5.14 parts per million in December. Now, put that in context, the CO2 levels are normally between 350 and 400 parts per million, so that's a very small percentage rise. But nevertheless, I'm sure you all know, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. What that means is that as temperatures rise, CO2 keeps them down on the planet rather than moving away. And that temperature rise is what's causing all the problems. So the CO2 rise has to be addressed. And clearly the aim is therefore to eliminate fossil fuels, which are one of the main ways that CO2 gets released. Not the only way, of course, because we have other gases such as methane and nitrous oxide, but CO2 is what the concentrations needs to be on. You will be aware there was some talk about this at the most recent G7 summit. but people were rather disappointed that there wasn't a firmer, more definitive conclusion on the issue. So everyone now looks forward to COP21, which will be held in Glasgow in November of 2021. Everyone looks for firm commitments, commitments that will be met, not just lip service paid to. Incidentally, a lot of people don't know what COP stands for. As you see in brackets there, it stands for Conference of the Parties. And to me, one of the key things will be whether countries like China and India actually come on board with this, because they're the ones that are causing probably some of the biggest dangers and the most increasing dangers. Okay, well, then that's climate raising temperature rises, so we have to do something about it. So we move on to the next slide, which looks at UK energy sources and targets. These are the figures that government put out for 2020. And they show that from renewables, we're getting 42% of energy. That's 24% from wind. That's primarily offshore wind. We're getting 4% from solar, and we're getting 14% from bioenergy. Bioenergy is something I don't have much time to talk about today, but it's growing crops such as willow and poplar. It's growing oilseed crops such as oilseed rape, where we extract the oil and use it, or it's using biodigesters for crops such as maize and anaerobic digestion. Some of these can have quite an important part to play, but of course they are users of land as well, so we need to bear that one in mind. Fossil fuels have been declining. 41% of fossil fuels, of which 39% is gas, only 2% is coal, and that is rapidly declining. And the difference is nuclear, which will always be part of the equation and provides a stability at around 17%. The greatest increase of renewables is likely to come from wind, and that's primarily offshore wind. There was a date, 16th of August 2020, where 60% of all our electricity actually came from offshore wind. And there was a figure quoted for only about 5 or 6 weeks ago when 78% of our energy in one day came from offshore wind. So this is clearly the significant factor in the future. Government produced a paper called Build Back Green. It's written in nice, easy to understand terms, and it was written in October 2020. And what that paper said was that offshore capacity was going to be increased by 3 by the year 2030, 9 years down the road. And that would produce an extra 40 gigawatts of power. And this would mean that every home in the country, in the whole of the UK, could be powered by offshore wind. So that clearly is the future as the government sees it. Build Back Green will be building back by using offshore wind. So if we move on, I accept that still, despite these statements, solar energy will still have its part to play. So we need to ask the question, is solar energy efficient? And sadly, in my view, the answer is no, not very efficient. PVs, that's photovoltaics, have an efficiency rating of between 11 and 15%. This is simply, if you take the solar energy coming in, how it's converted to electricity that can be used on the grid. In other words, something like 85% is wasted, doesn't get used. Wind, on the other hand, is 50% plus. So wind energy is a good deal more efficient. And as you probably all appreciate, when we look at efficiency, we also need to look at the efficiency to build the turbines, to build the PVs. So building turbines has a carbon footprint of 7 to 56 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and building PVs 9 to 180 grams. In other words, building PVs is a good deal less efficient in terms of a carbon footprint. And of course, it's not simply that, because if you look at solar farms, you've got the wiring, the setup, the decommissioning, you've got the batteries, the battery storage, you've got all the transportation costs. And since we're bringing solar panels from China, there are huge transportation costs. The actual efficiency in terms of environmental terms of PVs, of solar, is really very, very poor. I quote one particular source, which was a refereed journal, SSRN. This is the this is a German research paper, and it stands for the sorry, I've just missed my details on the Social Science Research Network. The Social Science Research Network, um, written by German scientists, looking to see if they could fuel Germany with photovoltaic cells in Spain, because Spain was the most efficient place to put PVs. And their conclusion was today's solar technology, an environmentally and economically unviable choice. It was a damning report that said solar was a total waste of time for fueling Germany. And obviously you can take those implications for other countries and their production. So that's really saying to you, solar energy is not desperately efficient. If we can move on, I asked the question, is solar energy safe? Well, there are health risks. What is called electromagnetic sensitivity is an area of health risk for human beings. But in all honesty, it's probably not that serious. Far more serious are fire risks. There are a number of battery technologies. One of the more dangerous ones are NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries, and they have a very high risk of thermal runaway. Thermal runaway is when one of the cells in a thermal battery goes wrong, and rapidly this thermal energy going wrong spreads to other cells very, very rapidly, causing a fire that doesn't need oxygen to keep it going, but causes a very high risk of explosion and can be very, very difficult to exterminate. The thermal runaway can also apply to lithium-ion batteries, and these are the batteries that are being developed most rapidly. Now, in 2019, there was a very, very bad fire in Arizona. A number of firemen were very badly injured, and there was a very great amount of damage caused. This began to get people very concerned about fire dangers. And 7 or 8 months ago in Liverpool, there was equally serious fire involving lithium-ion batteries that took the Liverpool Fire Brigade a long while to sort out. And again, there were some minor injuries. The Health and Safety Executive have been investigating that fire. And although it's now many months ago, we still await a report into the implications of that fire and how it can be avoided in future. There was a bad fire only months ago in Belgium when someone was killed. And I looked up some research done by the Building Research Establishment, the BRE, which surveyed all fires connected with solar and said that they came across 58 serious incidents, one of which involved a fatality and 5 of which were on solar farms. So we do have a very serious situation. Point 4 is the safety of grid scale batteries. This is the title of a paper produced in June 21, the 6th of June 21, so very, very, very recently. I hope you appreciate you're getting some very up-to-date information in this lecture. Well, that was produced by 3 very well-established, well-renowned scientists, Fordham, Allison, and Melville. Sir David Melville used to be Vice Chancellor of the University of Kent and well known for his work on the subject. And this research basically said, hang on, have a halt to these batteries, particularly those connected with mega scale solar farms, because the danger is huge. Local fire brigades don't have the technology to cope with them. And really, we have a very serious issue. If you want to read more, I understand that this Sunday's Mail on Sunday, and I'm not particularly promoting that newspaper, but it will have a very major article dealing with these dangers. So that is solar energy safe? And the answer is there are significant dangers. Never mind, let us move on. Let us say to ourselves, we are going to have solar, it's going to be a part of the future. So what are the alternative sites? Where should we be putting solar power if indeed it has a part to play in our future? Well, again, the BRE, the Building Research Establishment, did say that we have a quarter of 250,000 hectares of south-facing commercial roof space. And if that was all used for solar panels, we could produce half of our UK's electricity requirement. People have questioned this and said, well, will the roof space take it? Are there structural issues? The answer is no, you can get insurance to cover this. They ask about the payback time. well, capital can be paid back in between 5 and 10 years, and the solar panels are guaranteed for 25. So you have 15 years of profitability, and that is something that I would certainly be more than happy to encourage. There are, of course, private homes, and there are 17 million homes, and only 6% have PVs, and the government's target is 400,000 new homes over the next 5 years as a very minimum. So there's plenty of scope. And I'm told that if you go to Germany, new build has to have solar tiles, and I believe that to be the case, though I haven't verified it. But if we neglect buildings, be they commercial or private, we still have an awful lot of potential in our land. We do, in fact, have 7 million hectares of grade 4 and grade 5 land. And in Essex, because I was mentioning Essex in particular, we have 30,000 hectares, something in the order of 70,000 acres of such land, which could be quite considerable. Brownfield sites are mentioned, and I accept that that they aren't necessarily so readily available, but there are parts of the country where brownfield sites can have a part to play. So that's the alternative sites for solar. Moving on, and we're now getting through our subject matter reasonably quickly, let us turn to look at biodiversity, because in terms of any use of land, what we do to biodiversity is important. Why is biodiversity important? Why is maintaining a range of flora and fauna important? Simply because we want to maintain stable ecosystems. In nature, the more complex a system is, the more stable a system is. I'm sure as a science group, you will appreciate that we have food chains, and food chains are not simple chains, but they are made up of complicated interrelationships, which are called food webs. In a food web, if you remove 2 or 3 species, other species will take the place. If you have a food web that's a simple chain of 2 or 3 species, and one of those species disappears, then the whole thing collapses. We don't want ecosystems that collapse. Ecosystems are absolutely essential to our standard or to our life, because they are things such as the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, without which human life wouldn't go on. So biodiversity is important, and that's recognized in government policy, which more and more is emphasizing biodiversity, must be there and must be encouraged. And it's likewise in planning policies, again, referring back to the NPPF. So one has to ask, what are the impact of solar farms on biodiversity? And I suppose it's a bit like Rumsfeld, who said, we don't know what we don't know. We don't really know the effects. Solar farms haven't been around for that length of time, so that we can really analyze in detail and have the research done to say what are the impacts. But what little we do know, and BSG Ecology, which is an independent commercial research company that has a very high credibility, in a refereed paper written 2 years ago, said that the evidence of solar farms' impact on biodiversity remains limited. There is little empirical data on the subject. Well, moving on, what empirical data is there? And my next slide actually just tries to find out what research has been done. I did quite a lot of study of the literature recently to see what I could find. I could find very little that was done in the UK, but I did find some research from Michigan State University, which looked at some Hungarian research and some other research. And for example, talking about insects, found that photovoltaics provided a false habitat to 300 species that were therefore under threat because they couldn't survive well under PVs. I found some research that was done on birds. This was done by McCarry and Harrison, and noticed 70 bird fatalities, and also reported that in some circumstances where arable crops were replaced by solar, many birds that thrive in arable situations were no longer able to thrive. And particularly if you had land where there was game cover crops, these were particularly good for many bird species, not least the game birds themselves. Work on bats has concerned Natural England. The bats get very confused by panels, thinking they're drinking sites. And there has actually been some research done on bats, again in the States, which indicates some of the problems. A fact has been quoted from research that diversity is certainly lower under PV arrays, and that's hardly a surprise when you consider the shading effects. Very little has been done in the way of comparative studies where you've had solar and non-solar and tried to look at the ecology of the areas. What work there has been on the small scale and really hasn't produced any evidence either way. It is true that solar farms can put in enhancement activities, can put in place mitigation actions, and these will have some positive effects, creating wildflower areas, creating areas of shade and so on. Agriculture in its own way has not been brilliant for biodiversity either. But I would suggest to you that if the mitigation actions that could be put in place on solar farms were put in place in agricultural situations, then in fact biodiversity could benefit even more. I mentioned earlier on that our previous countryside stewardship is now moving to environmental land management. And I would suggest to you that if in fact we put environmental land management schemes in place in agricultural systems, then the biodiversity will be enhanced, whereas we have very real dangers of biodiversity in the context of solar. The fact is we don't know. And do we really want to take the risk of putting in place something that could be there for 30 or 40 years, do possibly incredibly bad damage to the biodiversity and not being able to put that right? We shouldn't proceed without having a far better knowledge base on the effects of biodiversity. So finally, let me move to some other issues. It is very obvious that with solar farms, you're going to have an impact on landscape. Developers usually freely admit this, but they will tell you that they are going to put in mitigation measures, they're going to screen, they're going to put in place woodland areas so that you won't see the panels. I just have to remind them when I look at this particular scene that some of these landscape areas will take 15 or 20 years to have any significance. And if they use deciduous materials, which would be the right ones to use because that's mainly the native species, then through the winter time, the visibility is still badly affected. There are other issues. There are obviously dangers of flooding and drainage and water issues. There can be noise and vibration issues. Of course, the traffic, particularly at the construction phases, is considerable, and there are issues with glint and glare. The scope of this lecture doesn't allow me to elaborate on those areas. I'm sure by this stage you'll be beginning to say, he's gone on long enough, let's have a chance for a few questions. So can I just move then to a few conclusions? Renewables are important. There is no doubt renewables are important, and our future with renewables, in my view, is going to be mainly offshore wind. Solar does have a part to play. I accept that technology is improving. The efficiencies that I quoted earlier in the lecture will get better, as will the efficiencies of other renewables as well. PVs, photovoltaic cells, should not go on best and most versatile land or on 3B land, which I think is a planning loophole. And really, there are plenty of other sites and sites which are not of strong ecological value. Food security is a critical issue. It's an issue that's been totally underestimated by government, by planners, by politicians. It must come much higher up the agenda, particularly as climate change begins to have an effect. We don't want to see our nation starving, but with a surplus of electricity. Food security can be addressed, and we just need much stronger planning guidelines, much stronger planning laws to ensure we try and protect our land. We do, therefore, in my view, and I've said this ever since I was fortunate enough to get a Churchill Scholarship in the 1970s to study land use in Japan, we, like many other countries, should have a national land use strategy. The very last point is a reference to the scheme which is going ahead in my local area near Chelmsford. You can look up all the consultation documentations that Longfield have produced. I'm sure they'll be delighted if you wish to reply to their consultation documents. And there is a group that's hoping to doing its best to oppose the scheme and put forward sensible, logical arguments as to why it should not proceed. And that is the reference to this. If you Google Go to Longfield, you will find this information. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is my lecture. I hope I've given a fair and balanced view of all the issues. I'm happy to take questions either that have appeared in the chat box, which I see there are 3 or 4, and anything that's put to me. So I will hand back either to our chairman, Chris, or to Andy, and let you take it from there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mike. I'll go over to Andy because you can look in the chat box and perhaps answer the chat box questions first, if you would. Andy, if you could handle that.
Right, there's a question from Harry to everybody. And would Harry like to ask the question? Harry? Okay, well, Harry, I'll speak what Harry says. What scientific measures are solar farms developers required to implement and fulfill to ensure increases or decreases in biodiversity? What sanctions are imposed if biodiversity is damaged?
I think you've got to first of all prove that biodiversity is damaged, and that's one of the great things, that ecological surveys have to be done over a number of years, and that simply hasn't happened. So it would be very difficult in the short term to prove a damage to biodiversity. Normally planners, whether it's through the planning inspector or the local authorities, will look to see what enhancement and mitigation is put in. But then there is no proof that this will happen. There is no proof as to what good or bad it will do. It is just the developer's world that it is in place. It is good the requirements are there, but no one really knows the effectiveness.
There's a question from Karen, which is asking you, would you recommend us to have solar panels on our houses?
Well, certainly in my house, I can't do it because it's a listed building, so that's out of the question. The issue has always been payback time, and obviously it's the nature of the roofs, where they are, if they're south facing and so on. The payback time has been a long while, so I think one needs to be in the property a long while to justify it, and whether it enhances your property price enough to give you some comfort is doubtful. I think on balance, the answer would be yes, if I knew I was going to be in a property for a long while, because those people that have been in the position where they put panels on have found some advantage. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question on chat, and then Wendy has a question. First, another question from Harry. Accepting climate change will increasingly have a damaging impact on food production. Lower rainfall, for example, added to which solar panels shade and shelter soil from rainfall. What impact will this have on herbaceous food sources essential for non-vertebrates and small mammals?
Well, a negative effect. It will have a very damaging negative effect, and that's one of the concerns that we have with all of this. If you think about it, you've just got a very unnatural environment when you put something artificial over land, as opposed to letting rain and everything else go naturally through the land. It's clearly a very obvious impact. A lot of this, of course, also depends on the positioning of the panels, the heights of the panels, the density of the panels. It's not a simple thing. If you have high placed panels, well spaced, then which clearly use more land, but you also have more scope for mitigating in the areas in between.
Thank you. Wendy has a question.
Yes, regarding the question about putting solar panels on our houses, and obviously you raised the quite large concern actually that the carbon dioxide impact of actually building those solar panels and putting them on is quite significant. And so would you say, I believe this is probably true, and it's the stance I'm taking, that we are better off putting more money into insulating our homes?
Yes, yes.
I believe that to be the case, but I have to be honest and say that my expertise is land use, agriculture, environment, and not on the efficacy of solar panels on houses. So this isn't my specialism. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. There are lots of things in terms of insulation, double glazing, all these areas rather than solar panels that probably could be more effective. And if you want to talk about where solar panels are produced, mainly in China, with supposed use of slave labor, then I think you have quite a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Chaplin has a question.
Yes, I can come in with solar panels, first of all. I had mine 10 years ago, so I get a very good feed-in tariff. I've got some more now, but I don't get any feed-in tariff on them because they're more recent. And I did look into the carbon balance, and I couldn't really find out, a lot of energy goes into making them. Glass needs a lot of energy, and also the special metals. And again, the efficiency is quite appalling, really. 17% isn't very good. But anyway, the question I wanted to come up with, tidal it seems a good way forward. It is so reliable. I think the answer is it's too expensive, but then the government's spending huge sums on Hinkley Point. So probably it would have been better spending it on tidal. So I wanted to make that point. And then I've got another point. I'm a camper. I've got a camper van. I was on a farm, and the farmer was putting in solar panels. All the chaps were on there, and I was in a corner. And the farmer said, "I will make more money from my solar panels than the crops I can grow on that field." And I thought there was a message there. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you're a farmer and you get offered land for sale for building, you're going to take it because it's going to make you rich for life. If you look at the money being offered for solar farms, it's somewhere around £1,000 an acre. Well, that's £1,000 you're getting in for doing nothing. The appeal is clearly there. The whole solar farm thing is being driven by money. If a developer can get a huge tract of land and can produce electricity from solar panels and sell it to the grid, they will make money. They will make money despite paying £1,000 an acre. It's a very easy money generating scheme. And for a farmer who is reliant on up till now European Union subsidies, European Union grants and things that are going, and it will be replaced by environmental land management. The income from crops and livestock alone will not suffice to produce a viable income. £1,000 an acre is very appealing. I can understand why the NFU do not come out against solar farms, because they're protecting their members, and solar energy is one way of achieving this. That doesn't mean it's good, but it's the fact of life.
Yes. So do you think perhaps legislation should be in place to persuade farmers only to have them on very poor quality land?
The legislation should be directed more firmly through the National Planning Policy Framework, so that planners, planning authorities, the planning inspectorate nationally do not permit development of this sort on land that can be producing food.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a comment from Anne Noble. Our issue with Sonica is that the solar alone is not viable. The scheme relies on the batteries and the ability to trade electricity.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. The batteries are a key to all of this. Well, the thing with solar and the thing with wind is electricity is only produced when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing. And what you do is store and release back onto the grid when the grid needs it. And trading is one of the key things. But the great worry is, as I said, if you're storing with batteries that have a huge fire potential, then you want to be avoiding those explosions. We don't want to be creating another Chernobyl near Newmarket or whatever near Chelmsford. And this is a serious point. This is a serious point.
Are there any more questions? If you could indicate. Oh, from Harry again. Morally, who owns our access to our countryside? Us or private landowners after a quick buck? I suppose that's more of a moral point rather than a...
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I won't get involved in moral arguments about access, but we obviously have access through footpaths, bridleways and whatever. And one of the keys with any of the solar farms is the access is still maintained, because sometimes the fencing and everything else can make the solar farms quite restrictive.
Robert Lloyd had a question.
Yes, I'd like to endorse what Paul Chaplin was saying about tides and all that, because after all, if you go to Woolbridge in Suffolk, there is the tide mill, and people in the Middle Ages were able to use the tides to power this mill to grind their corn and all that. Okay, now we've been mentioned, the sun and the winds are variable and can't be predicted, but the tides are very predictable and reliable. So surely we could do a lot to make use of that.
Yes, I think, I mean, again, I don't pretend to be an expert in these areas, and I know wave power, tide power is a factor that can be utilized. I think there are also environmental consequences sometimes by preventing the movement of fish and water aquatic species through tidal barriers. But there are trade-offs, and there are trade-offs when you use that technology as well. I still come back to agreeing with the government that the most viable way forward for renewables is offshore wind.
Thank you. Is there anybody? Oh, yes, Brian and Elizabeth there. You need to unmute yourself, Brian.
There it is. Thank you. Number of things. First of all, domestic PV solar power. We too have had solar panels for 10 years, and they paid for themselves within 5 years. And I feel that, I take the point about the manufacture and so on, the carbon footprint there, but we are not taking from the national grid and therefore reducing the demand there. And secondly, did you know that Essex County Council have recently actually concluded a sort of group buy scheme for not only solar panels but also battery storage? The next point I'd like to make is I fully agree with Robert and the other gentleman who talked about tidal energy. There was a scheme to install this in the Bristol Channel, in the estuary there, notably with lagoons on the South Wales coast. And that was fully investigated, but the government of the day, some years ago, decided it was too expensive, which I think is terribly short term. After all, in France, they've had tidal power generation for many, many years. And the other thing too, going back to the domestic scene, is that gas boilers, even condensate boilers, are apparently going to be phased out in due course in favour of heat pumps. In other words, you drill a couple of boreholes in your garden and just extract heat from the ground. So there's another aspect to consider, and maybe that might become the favourite domestic source of energy in the future. Thank you very much.
I have nothing to comment on that. I think it's some very well made points. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
I think we all endorse that, and excellent talk.
Very
well made points. Are there any further questions, Andy?
I think Andy's muted.
Andy, you're muted.
Yeah, Wendy, you have a question.
Yes, I just thought I'd bring the question back to the food security, and what would be, or what do you think you could say about using different types of food? What could be coming in the future? We hear all sorts of things about perhaps insect crops, and perhaps I've heard things about perhaps seaweed we could use perhaps in the more shorter term.
Well, that's a whole new lecture, isn't it? The sources of food. I mean, I think one of the most talked about scenarios is as we have to become more vegetarian in our food, because obviously that's a much more efficient way of producing food for us than converting it through animals. And if we are going to convert through animals, then white meat is far better than red meat. So all the debate about beef and Australian imports, become less relevant in that context. I also think that the whole issue of methane and livestock will be a factor that comes into the equation. And if we're going to be importing perhaps 55, 60% of our food in the future, then we're certainly going to need to look at alternative methods of feeding ourselves, especially when there's even more mouths to feed. So yeah, a whole range of new crops, new possibilities will all be part of our future.
See anybody else with a question? Perhaps you can come back and talk about food security.
Yes, indeed.
Right, okay, hand over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Before I thank Mike, it was interesting to see we had 52 screens was the peak that I saw, which I would estimate that's 70 to 80 people, because nearly all the screens there was 2 people on. And also I was welcoming people, and if I missed you and didn't welcome you, my apologies, but I do welcome you. I'm glad that you were able to come to our talk and listen to what Mike had to say. Also, 2 people unable that I know, or in fact there's several people, but in particular Richard Oscroft has asked if this is recorded because he said he was probably unable to get to it, and also Gordon Ingram, who is chairman of Heritage Writtle and has been in much email correspondence with Mike about this, and of course they've known each other for years. But also I think the standard of questions that were asked to Mike was very high, and really showed the interest level in this subject. And not only that, the range of what Mike was able to talk about. And as ever with Mike, it was a very comprehensive and well organized talk, which gave an enormous amount of information. And I know in some areas Mike was brief on the subject because otherwise he'd have been on too long, but he could expand on that. But he covered a whole range across this subject in a very comprehensive way. And I'd like to say thank you, Mike, for all the time that you've given in preparing this, let alone presenting it, because you mentioned how many sources that you've gone to of information. And as you know, it's been recorded so other people can listen to this. And also some of the people which, and whether I heard this from you or I heard it from elsewhere, is a lot of councils, and you probably didn't want to say this, but a lot of councils haven't given real strong consideration to this as to what the effects are. They see that it seems to be a quick solution, and with so many questions to deal with and issues to deal with, and they haven't really thought it through as to what the effect is on this. With, as the points that you made, we have an increasing population, a diminishing amount of land in which to produce it, and in fact a flat level of production. And this obviously is going to cause many problems in the future. Anyway, in conclusion, I'd like to say thank you very much, Mike, for giving your time on this subject. I'm very well prepared, and thank you very much. And also thank you everybody for listening. But thank you, Mike, Professor Mike Older, for the huge input you put into this.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Just let people know that it should be available tomorrow on the U3A Chelmsford website on the science group page. There should be a recording of this talk. And next month's talk will be using the same Zoom link. So if you want to join us next month, you're very welcome.
And as you'll
Thank
see,
you.
there's no password involved. And before I just thank Mike again, I just